like the fonts he picked.
Did you
I think
compliment
people got-
the font?
Yeah, I like the security and compliance. I like the ampersand in it.
It's the ampersand is nice. Like,
You know, I was telling May, because I showed this to her, I was like, I really wish I could take credit for the fonts and the colors, but I can't because this is just a built-in Google Slides theme. I just wanted something that wasn't going to look like a terminal because that's like everybody's default choice on this. So
I'm all about the hot pink and purple and like bright colors because, you know, I just need some personality because although my terminal is very colorful too. So
yeah, showing up to networking events with a big pink mohawk definitely is a way to create a memorable experience. So
I'm kind of jelly, kind of jealous about that. Like I'm liking that.
Sarah,
Right.
what's stopping you from getting a big pink mohawk?
Well, I'm
Yourself.
I like routine
That's the
and
answer.
I'm learning, but also it's the color because I also like purple and I also like green and I also like blue and I know I can change it, but I also just don't want
Why
the
not
maintenance
all the why not all the colors?
because that's even more maintenance.
Sarah,
All right.
you should see my shades of purple for your VS Code editor. It's an excellent theme.
Ooh, okay, you're gonna have to share that with me in Slack then. All right, let's go ahead and get started.
oh boy. All right.
All right, so go ahead and mute if you haven't muted, and I will go ahead and get started. Make sure I mute myself here. All right, I just want to say hello and welcome to everybody. Thank you for joining the Virtual Coffee Brown Bag Edition. Just as a little bit of a reminder, Virtual Coffee's mission is to be a welcoming tech community that allows room for growth and mentorship at all levels. We like to create meaningful opportunities for learning, leadership, and contribution for everyone, hence our brown bags. To find our code of conduct, events, or to learn more about our organization, go ahead and check out our site at virtualcoffee.io. So I just want to take a moment and say thank you very much, Roger, for being our presenter. To just introduce Roger a bit, Roger Gentry has managed the security and compliance for many clients across the United States, providing not only CTO, CSO level consulting to a variety of industries, but also working with customers to achieve successful compliance certifications in PCI, ISO, SOC, and more. So today, Roger's going to be giving us a nice 101 security and compliance walkthrough. This is going to be a conference style brown bag with some limited Q&A. So drop questions that you might have in the chat and we can sort through those. And without further ado, Roger, the floor is all yours.
Thanks for that wonderful introduction. So I'm going to start out with just kind of how I got to where we are today. So when I first started my tech career, so to speak, I started, as most of you guys do in Virtual Coffee, as a freelance web developer, which let me sort of build up that skill set and kind of took me forward into finding the next job. From there, I kind of advanced into the field of banking, which was very random. So I started out working as an ATM field technician, managing ATMs when their problems would arise, things like the cash cassette jammed or somebody put a ripped bill and the thing can't print anymore. I'd get called out, I'd go and do all the security things, unlock the safes and fix the problem. And that experience was something that I was like very excited for because it was interesting, but it carried me through and got me the next job and the next job and the next job, because not very many people are very familiar with what an ATM technician would ever do. And so it made me stand out, but I've always kind of just stood out with my own sparkling personality. So that's helpful as well. From there, I ended up as a systems administrator at a web hosting company, which was a far jump from going from never working in an office environment in my life to being the guy that customers are calling to tell me their servers are down and I need to fix it. And I willfully underqualified for that position at the time, but I learned everything on the job to figure out how to get there. And yeah, it picked up pretty quickly. So did I ever feel unsafe with the ATM job? I was in a relatively safe area, but we did have the option for guard service. So part of the call-in process, when you got a dispatch ticket, they would ask you if you need armed guards to show up to escort you across the property. I never needed that. However, when the police do show up after you forget the alarm code, that is an experience. Ask me about that another time. So this brings me back to the web hosting company, you know, fixing servers all day long, finding problems and dealing with things that I never experienced before, like hacked websites and WordPress sites being exploited due to bad plugins, et cetera, et cetera. So that carried me over to the career change that I made out of the web hosting industry and into the managed service industry. So if you've ever heard of a managed service provider, they are essentially your outsourced help desk. Smaller companies, bigger companies hire a managed service provider to take over their IT infrastructure and advise them on best practices in implementing services and solutions. So it was my job as the most technical person and the one that was willing to learn the new products to implement a lot of this stuff. And through that job opportunity, I was exposed to more companies than I can keep track of at this point. I've flown all over the country doing things that, again, woefully underqualified for in the moment, but then afterwards it became, hey, you know VLANs and you fixed that one customer that one time, so we're going to send you to do this and this and this. And then that experience comes and follows through. But through that position and through these companies that I was working for, we went from being a run-of-the-mill managed service provider to wanting to focus more on security and compliance. So through that, we had to go through and get our own security and compliance certifications, which was a process into itself. And that's a lot of what I'm going to share today. So that managed service provider was eventually bought out by a larger company, and my role transitioned from being the project manager, systems administrator, everything, to focusing purely on their cloud operations. And so that's what I did for a while, and managed the AWS, Azure, Google Cloud environments for multiple customers, ensuring that they would meet the compliance audits required for their industries. And then, yeah, from there, I transitioned due to the magic of the business world. And I'm currently running a consulting firm where we pick up contracts and help customers do a lot of the same things, as well as build apps, websites, and all the stuff that I had already been doing. So we are talking today specifically on security and compliance, which itself we could spend weeks on diving in intricate details on two little points. However, I have done my best to try to encompass as many important things as I can into as little time as I have today. So by the end of this, you should be able to at least be familiar with a lot of the terms that are used throughout the industry, understand the basics of security, and at least enough to go through, and when you get hired by a big company and they ask you some questions about their compliance and change management, you'll feel confident to know that you'll be able to do it, because no matter how different it is, it's all the same underneath. So we're going to start out with talking with one of the most important things that you use absolutely every single day and probably don't even think about anymore, which is passwords. You know, at the core of everything that we do today, we have a username and password associated with our account. But passwords are only as good as they are secure. So what makes a secure password? Well, this is a definition that has consistently changed over the years. And in, I believe it was either early 2020 or the end of 2019, the definition of passwords was changed significantly, but we're still waiting for the rest of the industry to catch up. So secured passwords are often defined by your company's policy or by Microsoft's policy or some other best practice implementation. But secure passwords are just passwords that are harder for somebody to guess, something that only you know, only you can remember. But in order to increase that complexity, you want to avoid using common passwords like God and dog and your name and birthday, which for the most part, as developers and internet users today, we are very familiar with avoiding those common traps. So I want to bring up a few other concepts too, as far as password security, because it is something that we use on a daily basis and is unavoidable. That's using a passphrase. So passphrases are going through and making your passwords a little bit more complicated by introducing additional sort of phrases to it, words, and making it a little bit more complicated. A good example of this is using something like, there's always money in the banana stand. Now, there are 1,000 different ways that we can rewrite this sentence. We can also say there's always money in banana stand 7 if there's a compliance requirement for there being a number in there. But what this actually does is it creates a memory, because you're never going to forget your password. You're going to go there and you're going to sit and be like, oh, I know exactly what this is, and type your sentence. But a machine this is going to take a machine very, very long to go through and brute force and guess against, which makes this inherently a more secure passphrase than, dog 57, acorn 32, whatever. Because this is something you can remember, you don't have to write it down or store it. It makes sure that it stays unique to you, it stays secure because only you know it, and it's something that you can type. So with that, I want to, this is probably the longest slide that I have in this whole deck, which is actually just talking about passwords best practice here, which is things we already know, things like avoiding password reuse, using complex passwords, but not ones that are complex to remember, because that's how you lose out. And so now we go through and we talk about password managers. Password managers are amazing. However, I have some personal feelings on those. We'll get there. And so additionally, though, there are other tricks that you can use using a formula, using a sentence. One of the ones that I use personally that has brought me a lot of good luck is using a unique email or username for every site you sign up. So if you're familiar, if you're a Gmail user or another service, you can actually add a plus to the end of your email address. So say roger@gentry.ch, which is my email. You add a plus in between Roger plus Microsoft@Gentry. Now I have a unique email for that account, which means that if you're an attacker, you steal that database, you get that username and you start brute forcing someplace else, well, that username and password is only going to be good with that one service. So it's going to be useless everywhere else. So they're not going to be able to pattern match you to another service or another leaked database based off of your identifying information, which is very helpful. So I wanted to provide a few password managers that I have personal experience using. These ones are all either free or free and open source, and there is no proprietary commercial software listed in here for a number of reasons. But in particular, as developers, it's also important that you have something that you're comfortable with using, that is something that you can take with you and something that you can manage your secrets safely. All of these are ones that I've personally used. Pass is one that is phenomenal if you love being in the command line and you want to live just inside there. KeePass and KeePass XC, also great choices. And Bitwarden is probably the most commercial service that I have in there. KeePass are going to require some more manual steps to get the synchronization and things across your devices working well. Bitwarden is the most open company as far as their service goes, and they do have a service that allows you to use their cloud to synchronize all your services. All of these have fun Chrome add-ons and everything else you need to make your life easy. So with that said, we're going to take the next step in security and talk about what we have done to make passwords, well, a little bit more secure, because it's very easy for passwords to be leaked and to make their way onto the internet. It's just the nature of the day that we live in. It's the valuable information that attackers want, so they're going to attack it. So we have started as an industry, we have accepted that multi-factor authentication is the best solution we have to mitigating against these types of attacks. So what multi-factor authentication essentially is it can be summarized into 3 words. We are going to trust but verify. So in the focus of multi-factor authentication, what does that mean? Well, we're going to trust that you are the user you say you are because you're presenting us with the correct password. But we're going to verify that you are their actual person by sending you this authentication code. And you're going to enter that in, which is going to validate that you are actually, in fact, the person you are. We're going to trust but verify that user authentication. So there's a few common types of multi-factor authentication that I want to talk about today. So the most common that you will probably have interacted with the most is SMS. You log into your bank website, sends you a 6-digit code, you type it in, and you log in, right? Everybody's done that. It's actually the least secure method of the 4 that are presented here, and I'll tell you why in a second. So the second method is app-based. Gmail is very, very easy to do this. You install their app, and then every time you log in from an unknown source, you get a pop-up notification that says, hey, do you want to allow this service to log in? You click allow or deny. There's other services, Authy, Duo, and a ton of others that allow you to have that same experience. Slack and some of these chat applications will send you a message and says, hey, this device is trying to log in. This is your code to log in. So this app-based method relies on you already have access to the service to then authorize an unknown device. But it's trusting that you have at least one of those devices that has been proven to be you and connected to the service. So then we also have email, which some vendors who don't necessarily have the capabilities to implement the app or SMS-based go with an email-based method, which honestly more secure than SMS, because your email is falling into oftentimes its own multi-factor authentication. If you're a Gmail user, for instance, it's taking best practices to secure that account. And so it's looking for possible exploitations and working against those. And then finally, we have hardware keys. So if you're not familiar, these hardware keys plug into your computer, either over USB or sometimes they use Bluetooth, and they provide that one-time passcode generated off of a hardware token that's on the device itself. These are typically identified as the most secure ways as far as authenticating services, because it is very, very difficult for you to be able to take that physical key and make a second physical key that's producing the same random code to authenticate the service. So multi-factor authentication provides us a huge advantage when you're logging in, because you're validating that the user is actually who they say they are. It's become an industry requirement for most compliance controls to say that if you're doing any sort of login that's accessing any type of sensitive data, you need to implement multi-factor authentication. Now, earlier, I was talking about SMS and why it's not so good. Well, here's why. There's something called a SIM-based attack. You can actually very easily take somebody's phone number and move it someplace else and get all of their text messages, which means from a security standpoint, if I get your phone number and you're using that phone number for securing all your accounts, I can now verify that I am the person that I say I am because I have the correct code. So let's see. As far as the keys, they look like just like a USB sort of flash drive is what the UV keys look like in the hardware tokens. Some of them just look like a little round keychain that you just have on your key ring. Some of them communicate over RFID. Some of them just communicate over a standard hardwired connection. So when it comes to security, probably the single most important thing is access controls, because who has access to your network, your data, your servers is who has access to that data. So we use access controls to limit what users can log in. We use that to control what type of users they are, whether they're an admin, they're a standard user, they're a power user. And we associate what data they can access based off of their level of controls. So we also implement access controls in firewalls and applications on server side. If you've ever had to open a port, that's an access control list that you're then allowing that port to go through. It's the same thing. If you're working in any sort of cloud environment, the access control lists are just defined differently. Amazon calls them security groups, Azure calls them something else, Google calls them something else, but it's all the same thing. It's your access control. It's the ports that you're allowing in, it's the ports you're allowing out, it's the traffic you're allowing to come through to your server, and the users you're allowing to log in. So access control is probably fundamentally one of the most important aspects of security, because if you can't access the device, well, it's harder to break into and steal the data. So we restrain and restrict that access as much as possible and only allow in exactly what we need to complete the task. Anything that we do have to store, though, we're going to need it to encrypt. Now, we could spend several hours explaining and talking about encryption. Fundamentally, what encryption does is it takes your secure password and it utilizes that to scramble the data, and then you can use that same password to unscramble the data. That's literally the basic way I can explain encryption in the course of this. So with that, we also have a lot of other mechanisms for encryption, such as SSH keys, PGP, and public and private keys, which fundamentally do the same thing. So when you connect to a server, you may have had in the past to use an SSH key, which is a massive string of random information that allows you to encrypt and decrypt the session. But when you're generating those keys, it often comes with two versions, a public and a private key. They're used together to say this data is secure and it's encrypted with your public key. And then when you get that data, you can't decrypt it with the public key, but you need the private key. That means that we're allowed to secure those sessions, secure that information, and secure that data without somebody reasonably being able to exploit that, assuming we're using a secure password like we talked about in the beginning. So encryption is essentially the way that we can secure the data by making it unreadable because it's scrambled. So what happens when we do get an attacker and they implement some naughty bytes to your network? Now, I'm talking about viruses, Trojans, malware, and more. But specifically, what are these things? I mean, I grew up in an age where I was dealing with these things every time I browsed the internet. The landscape of that has definitely changed a lot. But the methods that attackers are using to get the information on your computer have not. Viruses are, bad bits that are getting onto your computer to do something that you don't necessarily want. Trojans are software that says, hey, I'm this really awesome audio editing software, but really I'm mining Bitcoin on your computer all day, every day. And malware just is kind of the same thing. But really, where do these things come from? And a lot of the time it's through our favorite mechanism, spam. It poses as legitimate mail, sends you a link, downloads a file, you get installed. Email has gotten a lot better at detecting these things and shutting them down and making sure those links are actually secure. But it's still a problem, and it's still a huge reason why a lot of corporate networks get attacked, because they're sending spammy messages all day long and some users reply. The biggest issue, and if you ever worked within a corporate environment, you will definitely have to do some mandatory training on this, which is very fun. Phishing. Phishing is very much like spam, but it's kind of different in the sense that phishing is targeting more specific information. It's trying to convince you that it's somebody that it's not. So say you get an email from Microsoft saying your account's been deactivated, click this link to reset your password, click the link to reset your password. Well, that wasn't actually Microsoft's page. Now, there's a more sophisticated attack called spear phishing, which is even more elaborate and interesting. Spear phishing is a highly targeted version of a phishing campaign, which utilizes information from a particular company to attack. And I personally experienced this where we had a wealth management company call us up and said, hey, I got a weird email from my CEO. I checked, he said he didn't send it, but everything looks right on the email. It's got the right domain and the name's right and everything. In the context of the email, the supposed CEO said, hey, I need you to complete this wire transfer of $250,000 to this account. I need it done by 10 a.m. This was sent at like 9:30. It was really urgent, had to get done really quickly. He was unavailable because he was out of the office. But a number of things struck me as odd. Was when we called him, he said, I did not send that email and you need to look into this. And then we looked into it and we found a number of things that were quite alarming. Well, the attackers had purchased a relevant domain that had just a slight change in the two letters, very hard to notice unless you were looking at it. And they also dived into the website to find all of the CEO's information, his correct email, and they found some social media posts that he talked about being on vacation and utilized that information to try to extract money from the company. So spear phishing targets the company very specifically on information that they can gather publicly. We were able to shut that domain down, call the vendor and take over, and it was fine in the end and nothing actually happened, but it's still a risk that you have to be aware of. But one of the biggest problems that's affecting our industry today is actually ransomware. Ransomware does some very interesting things. And I want to talk for a second about how that ransomware works, because ransomware takes some legitimate technologies, our encryption, and wraps it all up in some malware and really pushes it out there to do the most harm possible. So when a company gets ransomware, which we've all seen in the news, it can come through one of a number of ways. A lot of the times it's something in their access control that wasn't quite up to date. Recently, it's been Microsoft not being patched on their servers. There's some zero-day vulnerabilities that were revealed, and in very short days, a matter of days, attackers were using those in the wild. So what happens when a company gets ransomed is they run through this application that then goes through and encrypts all your files, except they hold that private key that you need to decrypt those files ransom. And they say, give us a ton of money to decrypt that. these attacks have actually shifted a little bit in recent times, in which not only are they encrypting all your data, they're also taking a copy of it. And then they're holding that copy of the data saying, if you don't pay this ransom, not only are we not going to give you the decryption key, we're also going to sell all your data on the dark net. Now, there are a lot of steps that you can take to prevent ransomware from occurring. But all of those are mostly limiting access, restricting how frequently that data can be accessed. And there's a lot we can do to mitigate ransomware specifically, putting in trip files and everything. But here's the thing about IT. Here's the thing about technology. And here's the thing about this industry that is very unique. Technology is one of the few industries that is consistently under attack by unknown entities. Everything that you do, every application you run, every server you interact with is being attacked every single day. That's very unique to this particular field. And as a result, everything that we have to look at has to be coming from that security-minded place, because if you don't, if you slip up, then you could be the one responsible. That's also why, and this is what's so important about compliance. So compliance takes the concept of trust but verify and implements that at the corporate level. So we're trusting that your security is good, but we're going to go through and verify it anyways. So let's talk about what is compliance. Well, compliance is essentially checklists, documentations, meeting, automation, and testing. Things we know we are supposed to be doing. But what actually happens is an outside auditor will come in and they have all the things that your company needs to be compliant with your industry requirements. And they just go down a checklist asking you questions. And so from there, you have to produce documentation that you had the meetings, that you have proof of the automation, that you've tested all your aspects, and you've done your due diligence to look for those security problems. We can't be perfect, but we can do our best to make sure that we're not implementing things that are going to cause problems. So there's a number of different types of compliance certifications: SOC, PCI, GDPR, HIPAA, ISO, and they're all pretty much the same. They have different levels of requirements, but fundamentally, they're all looking for the same things. Is your network secured? Do you have access control? Do you have privilege access? Are you managing least privileges? Do your first line technicians have access to the accounting database that is storing your customers' information? These are the things that these auditors are looking for. They're also looking for changes to your code. So as developers, when we go through and make an adjustment, that's a change. And oftentimes those changes can implement new vulnerabilities. So when you're working with an organization that is under any type of compliance certification or a compliance audit, there's other steps that you have to take as a developer to ensure that you're doing things, in a way that makes the company stay compliant. And a lot of this just comes down to, say, you need to implement a change to your code that fixes a problem. Well, if you are just a one-man shop, you may be tempted just to implement that fix and push it to production and be done with it. However, when you're dealing with 30, 40 developers, that doesn't necessarily work, because we need to understand the reasonings why you're making that change, what it's going to impact. So specifically, change management and what is necessary to be compliant is just identifying, hey, we have this problem. We recognize that this problem is going to impact these systems, and it can potentially impact this item over here. These are the risks that we're identifying with making this change, and this is our rollback plan. From a compliance level, you've done everything that you need to make sure that if you implement that change and something goes wrong, you can roll it back. But you also identified how that change is going to impact the organization. And all the compliance step is doing is ensuring that the company is implementing those processes and are following them. Because when you do that, you run into less problems when things go wrong. So let's talk about pen testing and vulnerability management. And I know this is a lot, but I'm just trying to get through enough things so we all understand. So part of auditing and security is also double checking your work. And we can do this through penetration testing, which is essentially scanning the network and looking for holes, and then trying to exploit those holes, getting inside that network and finding more holes. companies get paid obscene amount of monies on just this aspect alone. Vulnerability management is very similar, except for you're running scans of the software that you have in place, the dependencies, and looking for potential zero-day, potential vulnerabilities, or notices from the vendor saying like, hey, there's a problem, you need to update this particular management or this particular package. So in order to be compliant, not only do you have to do all of these things, you have to document them, you have to have meetings about them, you have to automate them, and you have to have complete records about how you maintain that security. So we've talked a little bit about change management and penetration testing and vulnerability management. All of these kind of fall into what it takes to code software. But for developers, and this is the focus of the talk, is just getting into this step here. When you're writing change management, it seems like a very daunting task if you've never done it before. But here's how it actually goes down. If you're working at a company that has any sort of source control management, such as a GitHub or GitLab server, which is what we used, you just create an issue. And inside that issue, you create a template for all of the things that are required for change management. Now, every time you make a change, part of your workflow as a developer is creating your own issue in GitHub, filling out all of the information, having somebody else look over it and approve it, and then implementing it and closing that ticket. That is compliant change management in a nutshell. There are a lot of other ways that companies can implement it, but on the minimum level, if you're familiar with opening and closing Git issues and submitting pull requests, then you'll absolutely be able to work for a compliant company, no problem. But knowing that is half the battle, because it wasn't until I was under a compliance audit that I realized how actually easy it was to be a compliant company. Because all you're doing is implementing best practices and then following those best practices and following your own processes. You're documenting your changes, you're testing those changes, and you're constantly looking for security vulnerabilities and security holes for you to fix. It's about communicating with your team and identifying problems and collectively resolving them. So for developers, the biggest thing that you can do is just be aware. Take good notes. Make sure you just do your best to safeguard the data that you're responsible for. But most importantly, and the overarching theme of this entire talk, is always trust but verify. Trusting the user is who they are, but more importantly, trusting that your vendor is doing what they're supposed to. If you're storing your data with a third party, how do you know that they're doing their job? That's what the compliance is supposed to check out for you. But personally, I don't trust that. I go through and try to verify what the company says that they're doing. So got a question here. What is trust versus distrust? So trust is, by definition, something that has to be earned, right? You can't just inherently trust somebody. You can say, oh, I'm a very trustworthy person, and that's an immediate red flag. So for me, I have a story that I like to tell, because we worked with a number of backup vendors, okay? And what we had is a sort of situation where one of our servers crashed. It was completely down and the company was unable to work. Well, we were okay because we had a backup, and that backup was stored in the vendor's cloud. So this is literally the worst case scenario you could possibly run into, is a complete system outage and having to do a recovery from nothing. But here's the problem. When I called their support line and waited on hold for 45 minutes to be talked to a representative and request an expedited copy of that data, they gave me a ridiculous quote of $15,000 to provide me a 3 terabyte hard drive in the mail next day. That did not sit well with me at all, because this is a situation that was an emergency on our end. It was an emergency for our customer, and the vendor that we had entrusted to make sure that that data was going to be available basically said, you're out of luck. Your best bet was just to wait for the download to complete. Now, we were trying to do a restore to the customer site locally, and their download was not great. So this was looking at a week, 2 weeks of recovery time, completely unacceptable. I was very upset because, obviously I had put trust in that vendor to do what they said, and they didn't. So at that moment, I made the decision, we're never doing this again. And as soon as we're out of the situation, we're going to evaluate, make some changes. So I did the next logical thing and built a new server, drove to the data center, plugged it in, restored the customer server, and then drove it to their site and got them back online before they started their day. Now, what ended up happening with that vendor? Well, we were paying them a lot of money every single month. And when we called them and told them that we were canceling their account and they asked why, I very, very heatedly pointed to the support case in which they screwed us over. And they apologized and offered us all sorts of discounts and everything else. But it was at that point that I had already made the decision, wrote up the proposal, and had approved on completely in-housing and hosting our own backup infrastructure, utilizing a software vendor that just provided the software and none of the rest. From there, we built our own infrastructure. We backed up all of our customers and like never had that problem again. We had complete system outages, and guess what our recovery time was? Minutes, because we had everything stored in the cloud environment, and it would take 15, 20 minutes to reconfigure the environment to be running in AWS, and that customer is now back online. Never again did we run into that problem. And when we were acquired, the parent company actually matched what we had, and we managed to merge all of our systems so seamlessly because we didn't have to replace an external vendor. And that came from that whole distrust of never wanting to be in a situation in which I'm responsible for recovering a customer and the vendors lock me out. Ever since that day, my philosophy on technology has shifted towards, if you do not have a copy of your data, if you're not managing your keys, if you can be locked out of that vendor for any reason, then you can't trust them because they will do that. And here's a good example of what not to do in technology, all right? If you want a fascinating use case of things not to do, look up everything that happened with the Parler app, how they were disconnected from AWS, their database leaks. Everything that happened with that application is a good example of things you can avoid as developers, because there's a lot of things that were very easy to not make mistakes. There are a lot of steps where you could implement a few best practices and they would have been in a much better situation. But they were reliant on a single vendor who closed the door and said, you have to go. And then they had to panic. There's ways to prepare against that. And that's what some companies recognize is your data is very important to your business. Without that data, does your business still exist? And then if so, how are you safeguarding that data? How are you trusting that that data is maintaining that security? And how are you checking off that the data and the people that have access to that data are doing what they're supposed to with that data? It's complicated. There's a lot of moving pieces, but that's what compliance helps with, is helps giving you the foundation to understand what's required to make sure that data stays secure. And with that, I'm more than happy to open the floor to questions.
Absolutely. If you want to ask a question, go ahead and unmute yourself. Just kind of like virtual coffee, let's chit chat, or if you want to stay muted or you're in a noisy environment, go ahead and drop it in the chat and either Roger or myself will read it off.
I think I got all of the questions that were in the chat already.
Yes, I have a question about how public and private keys work. Like, I'm familiar with the concept from hearing it discussed over and over again, but I don't quite have my head around the algorithm that's used to combine them and how they really work.
That is a good question, and I feel like we could spend a whole brown bag episode on that in itself. But essentially, when you're talking about public-private key authentication, you've got 4 keys. Okay, 2 keys are on your server, 2 keys are on your device. You have a public and a private key on each one. A public key is countersigned by the private key.
The public keys on each are different from each other?
Yes. So,
Okay.
So for instance, the best way to explain this is if you and I were going to communicate, say, over email, and we wanted to encrypt it, we can use what's called PGP, or pretty good privacy, which is the multi-key public-private key algorithm. What we would then do is we would separately generate our own public and private key. We would then share each other's public key with each other. We would then use the public, I would then send you a message, encrypt it with your public key and my private key, which signs it and says, this is a message that is coming from Roger. Then you use your private key and my public key, which verifies that which decrypts my information and then decrypts the message. And together, all of that assembled, you get the complete sort of secure password. So the way to think about it is like this. When you're encrypting the file, all right, you've got your public key and you've got your private key and my public key. You combine them together and you get a super long password, and then it uses that to encrypt the file. And then it does it in the reverse to retrieve the information in plaintext. That's a very simple way to explain it, but it is very much more complicated than that. But it is definitely something that's taken me a long time to wrap my head around. So you're not alone on there. Don't feel like, oh, I don't understand this, and it's not easy. It's a very complicated step, but once you kind of understand that, like, it's just like a fancy way to make a super long password, and then you're using that super long password to encrypt stuff.
May I follow up?
Sure.
Okay, so I'm receiving your message, which is based on your private key and my public key. How do I use how does that give me enough information to decrypt it when I don't have your private key? I only have my private key.
You have my public key though. So my public key says that I'm signing, that this message is from me, but I'm encrypting it with your public key, which you have the second key, the private key, to decrypt that message. So when I encrypt it with your public key, it can only be decrypted with your private key. And so when you encrypt it with my public key, it can only be decrypted with my private key. So when I send the message, you're decrypting it with that second key. It's kind of like a safety deposit box at the bank, right? You've got a key, the bank's got a key. You need both keys to open up the box. I have a link that I'll share that is a very good article that I think dives into this better than I could probably explain it right now.
Awesome.
Okay, great.
I'll make
Thank
sure
you so much.
we get that shared in a virtual coffee too, because I know I would like to dive into that a little bit more. Meg, I believe you had your hand up next. Go ahead and
Yeah. Could you go to that authentication slide where it had like the SMS and the hardware key and all that? Yeah. So for like something like the Google Auth app, that's app-based authentication?
Yes.
So as far as level of security, is that like a good way to go?
Yeah, the Google Authenticator is kind of one of the more common used two-factor authentication apps. The other big one is Authy, and Authy is also compatible with the same algorithms that Google Authenticator uses. And it's actually provided by Twilio too, which is one of the major vendors that does SMS-based two-factor authentication or multi-factor authentication.
Which one do you use?
I've used Authy for far too long, so it's one of these things that's just sort of muscle memory at this point. But yeah, I mean, for the most part, they're relatively similar. They're generating that randomized token. You're utilizing that to enter into the website. The most secure way is definitely with the hardware keys, though, because it's just you have to have that physical key. So
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
all right, Travis, you have your hand up, and this may or may not be our last question, so we'll see how much time is left. We're coming up on a quarter to one.
Yeah, want to echo thanks again for doing this, Roger. I really appreciate it. I feel like we haven't gotten enough security kind of perspectives, especially given that security seems to be ever increasing in importance. So I do appreciate the insight. I was wondering, so your concept of trust but verify is definitely something that rings true with me. But when you're talking about trusting but verifying vendors and third-party people that you are not a part of their organization, I'm sure it depends. It's sort of a case-by-case thing, but is there kind of a general way that you go about trying to verify that they are capable of doing what you're relying on them to do? Or how do you, I guess the question boils down to, how do you verify the capabilities of an organization that you do not have transparency into?
you ask hard questions. That is the answer. I've been on vendor calls and I've asked them very pointed questions about how they're doing things, and then the answers reveal that they have no idea. The other big one is when you're dealing with a company that says that they're compliant. Oh yeah, we're SOC 2 compliant, absolutely, great. Let me get a copy of that SOC report, buddy. And then they send me Amazon's. And then I'm like, this isn't your SOC report. Well, yeah, all of our stuff's hosted in Amazon. Oh, buddy, if you want some information, look up the AWS shared responsibility model. Amazon's responsible for 40%, and that 40% is the exact infrastructure controls. Everything beyond the infrastructure, you're responsible for. If you do not have a compliance report that names you as the vendor that is the one in the report, you don't have a compliance report. I have killed so many deals on that one question. We get, I was always on the sales call because like, they don't want the sales guys to keep calling them. So they put Roger on the phone and Roger asks them hard questions like, what's your SOC report look like? Yeah, great. Can I see a copy? And then they always freeze up. And then I'm like, well, we can't do a deal without that SOC report. It's a fun conversation when you get companies that are actually doing their job right. Backblaze, actually, I'm going to give a shout out to them. I switched over from, again, another terrible backup vendor story. This one happened on our end user computers, but very similar situation where we tried to recover something, didn't go well. I got angry, so I switched vendors. If you Google Bright Bear Roger Gentry Backblaze case study, there's a whole post on me that they wrote about the decisions on why we did that. But they were a company that when I talked to their sales team and I asked them pointed questions, I got the right answers. Oh yeah, we're doing this encryption. Yes, this is how it's set up. Yes, this is how you're going to need it. Oh, you need that set up? No problem. And that was an experience that made me trust the company because trust is earned, not granted. So verifying that a company is doing what they're saying they're doing is just by asking questions and looking for things that you would recognize in your own compliance controls as necessary. And so not every company is going to be honest with you, and you have to just sort of, it's kind of more of a game of cat and mouse, just trying to sort of, throw a question out there, see how they answer, and then follow up with another one until they reveal something that either you like or don't like. And well, there's some companies that are very good and there are other companies that are not so good.
Cool, thank you. Yeah, so just poke them and ask questions and know what you're looking for.
Yeah, that's the best advice that I can give you, yeah. As far as what those questions are, it really depends on the vendor. It really depends, but it can be things as far as like, how do you store your decryption keys that your technicians need to use to verify the data? Things that are just complicated. And a lot of the times in the companies that don't know what they're doing, I'll get back to you. I need to talk to an engineer. Those are always a huge red flag for me because it means that the salesperson does not have enough familiarity with their product to be confident in the security. So that's a good sign right there. And I can't take credit for the trust but verify though. I just want to let everyone know that is a Russian proverb. So it does vehemently apply to security and compliance though, because it's the underlying practice that we all look at is trust but verify that application is working. Is that application actually the application you want, or is it doing something nefarious on your machine?
Awesome. That was those are all really, really, really good questions. Thank you very, very, very much, Roger, for all this. I hope there are follow-ups to this because I think you've generated a lot of interest, a lot of questions. And I'm going to slightly put you on the spot and say you're one of our wonderful virtual coffee members. Since everyone here is a virtual coffee member, if you have questions or want to start a conversation, we now know who to ping. We are all going to learn together about security and compliance. That said, again, thank you everyone for joining. Thank you for participating and asking questions. We look forward to getting this video hosted and up for everyone else to watch, especially those that were unable to attend. If you have any questions or comments about anything in the virtual coffee world, as always, please reach out to one of the community maintainers. That would be myself, Kirk, Becca, and Dan. And we're always looking forward to new brown bags. So if you know of one that you want to hear about, to know of one that you want to give, anything, reach out to anyone, fill out that brown bag form, which I do not have the link to, darn it. But it's in virtual coffee. We can share it with you. So I want to share with everyone to just have a wonderful Friday and a great day. All right. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, Sarah.
See
Bye.
ya.
Thank you, Roger.